The moment Tamar Braxton allegedly opened her mouth, the family didn't just fracture, it detonated. No warning, no soft build-up, just a sudden flood of claims that turned whispers into wildfire and forced fans to look at the Braxton inner circle in a completely different light. Because according to Tamar, what was happening behind closed doors wasn't just messy, it was wrong. Insiders say this wasn't about sibling rivalry or old grudges resurfacing. This was about boundaries that were allegedly crossed, lines that were blurred, and a relationship dynamic so uncomfortable it had been buried for years under silence and family loyalty. When Tamar reportedly hinted at the truth, jaws dropped, not because drama was expected, but because this kind of allegation was never supposed to see daylight. What made it even more explosive was the collateral damage. Towanda wasn't just being accused of secrecy. She was being linked to decisions that allegedly affected her child, Ashlee, in ways the public never knew. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about adult choices. It was about how far-reaching those choices may have been, and who was expected to stay quiet to keep the family image intact. Michael Braxton's name being pulled into the narrative sent shockwaves through fans. The Braxtons have always sold unity, protection, and tight-knit bonds. But Tamar's alleged expose suggested something darker, a web of favoritism, inappropriate closeness, financial entanglements, and unspoken rules that made certain behavior off-limits to question. Social media froze, then erupted. Fans replayed old episodes, rewatched interviews, reevaluated moments that once felt harmless but now felt loaded. Tamar's past blow-ups suddenly looked less like chaos and more like frustration from someone who'd been holding in something too heavy for too long. And the most chilling part? Insiders claim this wasn't everything. This was just the crack in the dam, and once Tamar started talking, the family's carefully protected image may never recover the same way again. The tension didn't explode overnight. According to people close to the Braxton family, it had been simmering for years, buried under reunion hugs, forced smiles, and the unspoken rule that certain things are never discussed publicly. Tamar Braxton, allegedly breaking that silence, wasn't impulsive. It was the result of long-standing frustration over dynamics she believed crossed lines that should never be crossed in any family. Insiders say Tamar had been warning people privately long before anything spilled into public view. Not with explicit accusations, but with discomfort, with questions about boundaries, with repeated objections to what she described as an unhealthy level of entanglement between Towanda and their father, Michael Braxton, entanglement that went far beyond normal parental closeness. To Tamar, it wasn't affection that bothered her. It was control. According to sources, Tamar believed Michael's influence over Towanda's personal, financial, and emotional decisions was excessive and damaging. The family reportedly normalized it, brushing off concerns as Tamar being dramatic or confrontational. But Tamar allegedly felt that silence was enabling behavior that should have been questioned years earlier. This is where the narrative around Ashlee became especially volatile. There have long been rumors, never confirmed, never legally established, circulating in private circles about Ashlee's parentage and the way the family handled that subject internally. Insiders stress that these claims remain unverified and disputed, but they say Tamar believed the secrecy itself was the problem. Not what was true or false, but who was allowed to ask questions and who was shut down for doing so. People close to Tamar claim she felt Towanda was protected at all costs, even when the situation created confusion, discomfort, and long-term emotional consequences for others involved. Tamar allegedly saw this as a pattern. Michael defending Towanda unquestioningly, prioritizing her needs, and shutting down any discussion that made him uncomfortable. And every time Tamar pushed back, she became the villain. Family insiders say Tamar wasn't accusing anyone of something criminal or explicit, despite how the internet later framed it. Her issue, they claim, was boundaries and power. Who had authority? Who was allowed to question that authority? And why certain relationships inside the family were treated as untouchable while others were scrutinized relentlessly. That imbalance reportedly fueled years of resentment. Old footage now feels different to fans revisiting it. Tamar's blow-ups, her anger, her emotional outbursts. Moments once dismissed as instability now appear, to some viewers, like someone reacting to pressure she couldn't articulate without being silenced. Insiders say Tamar felt gaslit, told she was imagining problems that everyone else refused to acknowledge. Towanda's role, according to these same sources, wasn't malicious. They describe her as deeply enmeshed in a family structure, where independence was discouraged and loyalty was rewarded. But to Tamar, that didn't excuse what she saw as complicity in maintaining secrecy that hurt others, especially younger family members caught in the middle of adult decisions. Michael Braxton's name being central to the discomfort changed everything. Tamar allegedly believed his authority made honest conversation impossible. Challenging him meant challenging the entire family system, and anyone who did that risked isolation. That's why Tamar stayed quiet publicly for so long. Insiders say when she finally started hinting at the truth, it wasn't about revenge. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying unspoken tension for years while being labeled the problem. She reportedly felt that the family's image mattered more than emotional health, and that certain topics were forbidden not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. The public reaction, once the hint surfaced, was immediate and polarizing. Some fans accused Tamar of crossing a line by airing family issues. Others questioned why the family reacted with silence instead of clarification. That silence, to many observers, felt heavier than denial. What makes this first phase so unsettling is that nothing has been definitively proven, yet the discomfort lingers anyway. Because the story isn't driven by evidence alone. It's driven by patterns, power, who speaks, who gets silenced, and who benefits from keeping things buried. Insiders insist Tamar didn't intend to destroy her family's reputation. She wanted acknowledgement, validation, an honest conversation that never happened privately. And when that failed, the cracks began showing publicly whether anyone wanted them to or not. As this chapter closed, one thing became clear to those watching closely. This wasn't about one shocking allegation. It was about a family system that may have relied on silence for far too long, and what happens when the person expected to stay quiet finally refuses. And if Tamar's allegations are only the beginning, then the most dangerous part of this story isn't what's been said, it's what still hasn't been addressed. As the fallout from Tamar's alleged revelations spread, the situation entered a far more volatile phase, not because new claims were made, but because the family's response, or lack of one, began speaking louder than any accusation ever could. According to insiders, this was the moment when discomfort turned into scrutiny, and long-standing silence started to look intentional rather than protective. What struck observers most was how quickly the family closed ranks. Towanda reportedly did not address Tamar's concerns directly. No clarification, no public denial, no attempt to reframe the conversation. Instead, there was distance, emotional, communicative, and visible. To many fans, that distance felt less like dignity and more like avoidance. And in situations involving power dynamics, avoidance often raises more questions than confrontation ever would. Insiders stress that Tamar was not alleging criminal behavior or making explicit claims about wrongdoing. Her issue, they say, centered on enmeshment, a family dynamic where boundaries blur, authority becomes unquestionable, and independence is quietly discouraged. According to those close to her, Tamar believed this dynamic shaped everything: finances, parenting choices, emotional loyalty, and even who was allowed to challenge the family narrative. Michael Braxton's role remained the most sensitive aspect of the discussion. Sources claim Tamar viewed him as the unchallenged center of authority, someone whose approval determined which family members were protected and which were criticized. In that system, Towanda allegedly benefited from proximity and loyalty, while others, particularly Tamar, paid the price for dissent. This is where Ashlee's name resurfaced in public discourse, and it's critical to be clear. No verified or legal claims exist regarding her parentage. Insiders emphasize that Tamar's concern was not about asserting a specific truth, but about how secrecy and refusal to discuss certain topics created confusion, speculation, and long-term emotional consequences. In her view, silence itself became harmful. Fans noticed something unsettling as old interviews resurfaced. Questions about family dynamics were often deflected. Certain topics were laughed off, others were shut down abruptly. Tamar's reactions in those moments, frustration, anger, emotional escalation, began to look less erratic and more like resistance to being dismissed. According to insiders, Tamar felt she was repeatedly asked to let it go for the sake of family unity, even when that unity required her to suppress legitimate concerns. Over time, that suppression reportedly turned into resentment, not just toward Towanda or Michael, but toward a system that rewarded silence and punished honesty. Towanda, sources say, may not have seen herself as complicit. They describe her as someone deeply conditioned to prioritize family loyalty and stability above all else. But to Tamar, that loyalty came at a cost, especially when it meant protecting dynamics that made others uncomfortable. The public reaction during this phase became increasingly divided. Some fans accused Tamar of being reckless, arguing that family matters should remain private. Others questioned why transparency was treated as betrayal, while secrecy was treated as virtue. That question lingered heavily, especially as no one stepped forward to clearly address the concerns being raised. Insiders say Tamar felt the weight of that silence acutely. Instead of open dialogue, she was met with distance. Instead of acknowledgement, she was met with reputational damage. Old labels, difficult, unstable, dramatic, resurfaced quickly, reinforcing her belief that speaking up came with consequences. What made this phase especially painful was the realization that the family's brand of unity may have depended on selective truth. Certain narratives were allowed, others were forbidden. And once Tamar challenged that structure, she became the problem rather than the issues she raised. Michael Braxton's continued silence became a focal point, not because silence implies guilt, but because in a family where his voice carried so much authority, silence maintained the status quo. To Tamar, that was confirmation that honest conversation was never going to happen internally. Behind the scenes, insiders claim attempts were made to pressure Tamar into softening her tone, walking back implications, and reframing her concerns as emotional rather than structural. She allegedly refused, not because she wanted chaos, but because she felt minimizing the issue would only perpetuate the harm. The narrative began to shift subtly. This was no longer just about what Tamar said. It was about why no one else was willing to say anything at all. In families built on hierarchy, silence often functions as enforcement, and many fans began to see it that way. As this chapter closed, one reality became increasingly clear. The Braxton family wasn't dealing with a single allegation. They were dealing with a reckoning over control, boundaries, and the cost of protecting an image at the expense of emotional truth. Whether Tamar's perspective is fully accurate or not, the discomfort it exposed could no longer be ignored. Because when a family relies on silence to stay intact, the first person to speak will always look like the threat. And the most unsettling part wasn't what Tamar had already hinted at. It was how much resistance there was to simply talking about it at all. By the time the third phase took shape, the conversation had shifted in a way the Braxton family could no longer control. This was no longer about Tamar's tone, her delivery, or whether she should have spoken at all. It became about what the family system looked like once her voice was removed from the equation, and whether that system could withstand scrutiny without immediately defaulting to silence. Insiders say this was the stage where Tamar stopped trying to be understood by her family and focused instead on understanding herself within it. That distinction mattered. She wasn't chasing validation anymore. She wasn't pushing for a group conversation. She was naming patterns, not accusing individuals, but identifying structures that had shaped her experience for decades. And once those patterns were named, they couldn't be unseen. Observers began to recognize a recurring theme in the Braxton family narrative. Unity was prized above clarity. Loyalty was rewarded more than honesty. And questioning authority, especially Michael Braxton's authority, was treated as disruption rather than engagement. Tamar's role, insiders say, had long been that of the disruptor, not because she sought chaos, but because she refused to normalize discomfort. What unsettled fans most during this phase was the family's continued refusal to address the substance of Tamar's concerns. Instead of confronting questions about boundaries, influence, and emotional control, responses, when they existed at all, focused on optics, protecting the brand, maintaining respectability, preserving the image of a close-knit family that had survived hardship together. But that strategy backfired, because as more people revisited old footage, interviews, and family interactions, a new interpretation emerged. Moments where Tamar was dismissed, times when her concerns were minimized, scenes where Michael's authority went unquestioned while others deferred. What once looked like normal family hierarchy now felt rigid, even suffocating. Importantly, no verified evidence emerged to support extreme claims circulating online. And insiders continue to stress that Tamar was not making explicit accusations of criminal behavior. Her focus, they say, was emotional enmeshment, power imbalance, and secrecy, dynamics that can exist without illegality but still cause harm. That nuance, however, was often lost in public discourse. Towanda found herself in an impossible position. According to sources, she may have genuinely believed she was protecting family stability. But as scrutiny increased, her silence began to look less neutral. Not guilty, but guarded. And in emotionally charged situations, guardedness is often interpreted as complicity, even when it isn't. Ashlee's name continuing to circulate online added another layer of discomfort. Insiders emphasize again that speculation about her parentage remains unproven and deeply contested. But the fact that such rumors existed at all, and that the family refused to acknowledge why those rumors took hold, reinforced Tamar's core point. Silence creates its own damage. Michael Braxton's role in this final phase became symbolic. As the patriarch, his refusal to engage publicly or privately, according to Tamar's perspective, represented the immovable center of the family system. Not a villain, but an authority figure whose power discouraged transparency. In that light, silence wasn't absence, it was control. Tamar's emotional posture during this phase shifted noticeably. She appeared less reactive, less explosive, more resolved. Insiders say she had accepted that reconciliation would not come through exposure or confrontation. It would come, if at all, through distance and boundaries. And that acceptance marked a turning point. Fans noticed it too. Her language softened, but her stance didn't. She stopped trying to convince, stopped explaining, stopped defending. That quiet withdrawal mirrored what she had accused the family of doing for years, but with one crucial difference. She wasn't hiding the truth. She was refusing to carry it alone. The family, meanwhile, doubled down on privacy. And while privacy is not wrongdoing, the contrast between Tamar's openness about discomfort and the family's insistence on silence created an emotional imbalance that many viewers couldn't ignore. The question stopped being, "Is Tamar right?" and became, "Why is no one willing to talk about why she feels this way?" That question lingered heavily. By the end of this phase, the situation had reached a kind of cold resolution. Not closure, but clarity. Tamar was no longer trying to fix the family. She was stepping out of a role that required her to absorb tension so others could remain comfortable. And in doing so, she exposed the cost of maintaining unity without accountability. The Braxton family image didn't collapse, but it cracked. What emerged through those cracks wasn't scandal in the traditional sense. It was something quieter and more unsettling. A portrait of how families with power sometimes prioritize control over communication, and how the person who speaks up is often labeled the problem rather than the messenger. This wasn't about proving anyone guilty. It was about acknowledging discomfort that had been dismissed for too long. And in the end, Tamar didn't expose a single secret. She exposed a system, and systems don't like being seen. If you've stayed until this moment, understand why this story matters. Not because of shock, not because of rumor, but because it exposes what happens when silence is treated as loyalty and discomfort is treated as betrayal. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about recognizing patterns that families, fame, and power structures rely on to survive without ever being questioned. What happens next won't come with headlines. It'll come through who keeps talking and who never does, through who sets boundaries instead of explanations, through who protects images and who protects their peace. Those shifts are already happening, whether the cameras catch them or not. So don't disengage now. Like this video to keep this conversation visible instead of buried under easy narratives. Subscribe so you're here when the next piece of this story surfaces, because it won't be loud, it'll be subtle. And comment because these discussions are shaped in real time by people willing to sit with uncomfortable truths instead of looking away. This wasn't about scandal. It was about systems, silence, and the cost of speaking up. And once you start noticing that pattern, you'll see it everywhere, whether people want you to or not.